It was supposed to be a routine trip to the grocery store, a mother, her two young children, and a cart full of errands to run. But what happened in that parking lot would change everything. A police officer, armed with authority but lacking compassion, decided to belittle and mock a black woman right in front of her kids. His words were sharp, his tone dismissive, and his actions seemed to carry the weight of someone who believed there'd be no consequences. But what he didn't know was that the woman standing before him wasn't just a mother trying to shield her children from his cruelty. She was a judge, and as fate would have it, his next court appearance was just days away, with her behind the bench. Stay tuned as this story unfolds, revealing an unforgettable lesson in justice, power, and unexpected accountability. The officer's words hung in the air, stinging like a fresh wound. The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she focused on calming her children, who were clinging to her arms with wide, confused eyes. Inside, though, she felt a mix of anger and sadness, not just for herself, but for her kids, who were witnessing something they shouldn't have to experience. As the officer walked away, she stayed composed, not letting him see the storm brewing within her. What the officer failed to realize was that the woman he had just insulted wasn't someone to be underestimated. By day, she presided over courtrooms, making life-altering decisions with wisdom and fairness. But in that moment, she was just a mom, trying to protect her children. As the days passed, she couldn't shake the encounter. And then, when she saw his name on her next case file, everything clicked. As she read through the case file, her hands tightened around the papers. It was him, the officer from the parking lot. His name and face were now in front of her, tied to a case that would soon come before her courtroom. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here was a man who had tried to strip her of her dignity without even knowing who she was. And now his future was quite literally in her hands. She spent hours reviewing the details of his case, keeping her emotions in check. This wasn't personal. It couldn't be. Her role as a judge demanded fairness and impartiality, no matter how much her heart ached for what had happened in front of her children. But as she prepared for the upcoming hearing, memories of that parking lot confrontation kept creeping in. Meanwhile, the officer remained unaware. To him, it was just another case. His confidence was unshaken as he prepared his defense, completely oblivious to the fact that the woman he had mocked was about to take her seat at the bench. The day of the hearing was fast approaching, and the tension was palpable. The question lingered, would justice truly prevail, or would the weight of the past tip the scales? The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with its usual energy. Lawyers shuffling papers, witnesses nervously waiting their turn, and the officer seated at the defendant's table, casually confident. He glanced around, indifferent to the seriousness of the proceedings. For him, it was another day, another challenge to overcome. But when the judge finally entered, his expression froze. She walked in with the same calm authority she always carried, her robe a symbol of justice that demanded respect. The officer's face drained of color as their eyes met, the realization hitting him like a freight train. The woman he had humiliated in front of her children was now seated above him, her gavel within reach. For a moment, the room felt heavy with unspoken tension. She acknowledged the court, her voice steady and professional, giving no hint of personal feelings. Yet, as she began the proceedings, her gaze briefly flicked to the officer, her expression unreadable. The officer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly stripped of the arrogance he'd shown before. Everyone in the courtroom could feel it. Something deeper was at play here. But no one knew exactly what. As the case unfolded, the stakes grew higher, and the room seemed to hang on her every word. What would happen next? As the hearing continued, the officer's nerves became impossible to hide. His confident demeanor had crumbled, replaced by fidgeting hands and uneasy glances toward the bench. The judge remained composed, asking sharp, direct questions that seemed to pierce right through his defenses. Yet she never let the personal history between them show, not even for a second. Just when it seemed the case was unfolding predictably, a twist emerged. One of the witnesses, a young woman who had been hesitant to testify, stepped forward. Her testimony painted a far more troubling picture of the officer's behavior, stretching beyond the current case. Her words were chilling, revealing a pattern of misconduct that had gone unchecked for far too long. The courtroom fell silent as her story unraveled. The officer's attorney scrambled to object, but the damage was done. Everyone in the room could see the judge listening intently, her expression still unreadable, though her grip on her gavel seemed just a bit tighter. For the officer, this was no longer just about one case. It was about his entire career and the choices that had led him here. And as the revelations piled up, the tension in the room reached a breaking point. What would the judge do with the power now resting squarely in her hands? As the courtroom held its breath, the judge leaned forward, her voice calm but commanding as she addressed the officer. She recounted the witness's testimony, her words measured and deliberate. Every syllable seemed to strip away the officer's defense, leaving him exposed. The weight of his past actions now hung heavily in the air, impossible to ignore. When it came time for her ruling, the room fell silent. She began by addressing the facts of the case, her tone professional and impartial. But then, in a move no one expected, she paused and turned her attention directly to the officer. In that moment, she shared the story of their encounter in the parking lot, not as an accusation, but as an example of how power can be misused, even in seemingly small moments. The officer's face was pale, his arrogance now replaced by a look of pure regret. The judge's words were firm but fair, reminding everyone in the room that justice isn't just about the law. It's about accountability and integrity. Her ruling was clear and decisive, holding the officer accountable for his actions in the case, while leaving him with a lesson he would never forget. As the gavel fell, the courtroom buzzed with a mix of shock and admiration. But just as people began to process what had happened, the judge stood and quietly exited, leaving everyone to wonder if this was just the beginning of a much larger story. As the courtroom emptied, the officer sat alone, his head in his hands. The weight of everything, his actions, the case, the judge's pointed yet fair words, was finally sinking in. He had learned a hard lesson, one that went beyond the legal consequences he now faced. Power, he realized, could either uplift or destroy, depending on how it was wielded. For the judge, the day marked a moment of justice served, not just in the courtroom, but in her own life. She had faced the humiliation of that parking lot encounter with grace, and had chosen to let justice, not anger, guide her decisions. Her children, too young to understand the full weight of what had happened, would one day look back and see the strength their mother had shown. The case would go on to spark conversations about accountability and respect, reminding everyone that true justice begins with how we treat one another, even in the smallest moments.